Before she reached the age of 15, he impregnated his own daughter, not once, but twice. The story of Willard Dawson, the most incestuous father ever exposed in Georgia, is one that shocked the small community of Rabun Gap in the 1970s. Isolated in the Appalachian Mountains, this was a family where dark secrets remained buried for generations until an inevitable collapse revealed a reality many would have preferred never to know. Rabun Gap, Georgia, 1978, a mountainous region where time seemed to run more slowly than in the rest of the country. Protected by deep valleys and precarious roads that made access difficult for outsiders, isolated communities maintained their own traditions. It was in this scenario that the Dawson family built their own reality, a world away from external scrutiny and the laws that govern conventional society. A descendant of one of the first families to settle in that region back in the early 19th century, Willard Dawson was 42 in 1978. His ancestors, arriving as pioneers, had based themselves on the tall lands where they built a small rural property. Over generations, a deep distrust of strangers and a reputation for isolation became known traits of the Dawsons, who rarely came down to the city except for the most essential supplies. Sitting approximately 12 kilometers from the nearest city was the Dawson property, located at the end of a dirt road that became impassable during heavy rain. A visibly deteriorated, two-story wooden structure built by Willard's grandfather served as the main house. Completing the property where Willard, his wife Martha, and his 5 children lived were a partially collapsed barn, a water well, and some areas of cultivation. Willard's second-degree cousin was Martha Dawson, born Martha Collins. Following a family standard of unions between relatives dating back generations, the two had married when she was only 16. With eyes always lowered and an erased countenance, she rarely spoke in the presence of strangers. The result of a life of deprivation and the physical and emotional wear of multiple pregnancies in precarious conditions was a woman who, at 38, appeared to be much older. 5 children were in the couple's care, 3 boys, Jacob, 19, Thomas, 17, and Samuel, 10, and 2 girls, Sarah, 15, and Rebecca, 8. Similar physical characteristics were shared by all: below average stature, asymmetrical features, and obvious dental problems. Already, Jacob and Thomas showed signs of erratic behavior, their days alternating between periods of apathy and explosions of unexplained aggression. When Sarah Dawson, then 15, was taken to the regional hospital after passing out during a rare visit to the city with her father, the story we are about to report began to surface. Opening the doors for an investigation that would reveal decades of a practice modern society considers one of the greatest taboos was what doctors discovered that day: improper relationships between members of the same family, resulting in children with serious development problems. Make sure to check if you're already subscribed to this channel. If not, subscribe now so you don't miss these impactful stories that reveal the darkest secrets of American families. These are truths that few have the courage to tell, but they need to be known to ensure they are never repeated. The day Sarah Dawson arrived at Clayton's Community Hospital is something Dr. Richard Thornton still remembers clearly. A cold October morning in 1978 was the setting, and the 15-year-old was unconscious when her father carried her into the emergency room. That his daughter had passed out while carrying shopping and that it was not the first time this had happened in recent weeks was Willard Dawson's explanation. From the first moment, there was something about his behavior that bothered me, Dr. Thornton said years later. The way he avoided eye contact, how he insisted on being by her side, how nervous he seemed when we suggested more detailed tests. That Sarah was extremely anemic and dehydrated was revealed by the initial exam, but the truth began to emerge during a more complete assessment. The teenager was pregnant, approximately in her 5th month. Visibly agitated when confronted with this information, Willard insisted he must take his daughter home immediately. It was at this critical moment that nurse Elaine Parker, with over 20 years of experience in delicate cases, intervened. She realized signs of possible vulnerability and created a private moment with Sarah while her father was referred to fill out administrative forms. When we finally stayed alone, I asked her about the pregnancy, Elaine reported later. With the emptiest eyes I've ever seen, she looked at me and said simply, "Dad said it's like that with all the girls in our family." The first indication of the horror happening on the Dawson property was this dialogue, uttered almost in a whisper. Immediately, The medical team called the local authorities, noticing the severity of the situation. Sheriff David Miller, who commanded the Rabun County Police Department at the time, arrived at the hospital less than an hour later. For questioning, Willard was detained, while Sarah was kept under medical observation. A search warrant for the Dawson property was obtained by the authorities, where Martha and the other 4 children were found. Alarming living conditions were revealed by the house. Although a diesel generator provided electricity, there was no running water or proper sewage system. Scarcely furnished, the rooms had mattresses scattered across the floor. Mostly canned goods and some vegetables from the family garden were the little food found in the pantry. However, most disturbing was the discovery of a girl of about 2 years old hidden in a room at the back of the house. Several worrying physical characteristics were possessed by the child, who was not on any official record: a head disproportionate to her body, wide-set eyes, and difficulties moving and communicating. Through tears, Martha Dawson, when asked about the child, revealed that this was Emma, Sarah's daughter, and that Emma's father, according to Martha, was Willard himself. That Sarah had given birth to Emma when she was only 13 was revealed by preliminary investigations. Never officially registered, never receiving medical attention, the girl's existence was unknown to any authority. Now pregnant again, Sarah was also carrying her father's child. An even more disturbing picture began to emerge as the investigation advanced. That Sarah had attended local school only until she was 10 was shown by school records, after which Willard stated he would educate her at home, something that never happened. Early abandonment of school was also the case for the 3 boys, while Rebecca, the youngest, had never been enrolled. They rarely saw members of the Dawson family, reported neighbors from the nearest properties, even if a few kilometers distant. Maybe 3 or 4 times a year they appeared in town, always with 1 or 2 of his children, never the whole family, a local merchant reported. Large amounts of supplies were bought before they returned to the mountains. Any attempt to start a conversation was cut short by Willard, who then left. Mainly from the occasional sale of animal skins that Willard and the older children hunted, as well as small-scale subsistence farming, the investigation revealed the family survived. A significant inheritance from a distant relative in the early 1960s had been received by the Dawsons, ancient documents showed, which explained how they could maintain the property despite limited income. But just beginning to be revealed was the darker aspect. At least 3 previous generations was how far the family's patterns of consanguinity dated back. That Willard's grandparents were first-degree cousins, as were their parents, was indicated by ancient county records. An extremely closed genetic lineage had been created by this pattern of relationships between close relatives, resulting in a number of physical and cognitive problems that became more evident with each new generation. As Sarah Dawson recovered her strength in the hospital, her story began to take shape through fragments of information she shared with her designated case assistant, Elena Winters. Gradually, Elena gained the teenager's confidence with patience and sensitivity, a teenager who had been raised to distrust anyone outside the family. "The world outside is dangerous and full of people who want to separate us," Sarah repeated, clearly reproducing what had been taught throughout her life. "Only within our family could we be truly safe," Dad always said. Deeply disturbing was the reality emerging from these conversations. According to Sarah, her father began to treat her differently when she turned 12. He explained that in their family, it was tradition for parents to teach their daughters what their adult life would be like. Having herself had a similar experience with her own father decades earlier, Martha, her mother, had been quietly complicit. There was no search for medical attention when Sarah became pregnant for the first time at 13. Using knowledge transmitted through generations, Martha acted as a midwife in Emma's birth. A disturbing lack of understanding was demonstrated by Sarah when asked how she felt giving birth. "I was special," Dad said, "because I managed to give the family a new, perfect member," she explained with devastating simplicity. "More perfect than the others was Emma," he said, "because she came straight from him to me." The devastating impact of the isolation and horror she had lived was revealed by Sarah's medical and psychological evaluations. Chronologically, she was 15. But her cognitive and emotional development was significantly delayed. Difficulty understanding abstract concepts was shown by her, she had a limited vocabulary, and, more worryingly, she showed no awareness that what she had suffered was wrong. If you are feeling deeply impacted by this story, you are not alone. To show that we cannot tolerate children growing up in environments of exploitation and neglect, leave in the comments justice for Sarah. So these stories are never forgotten, your voice is important. Meanwhile, more layers of this disturbing case were revealed by the investigation into the other family members. Clear signs of cognitive deficit were shown by Jacob and Thomas, the older children. That both had intellectual development equivalent to that of children aged 9 to 10 was indicated by psychological evaluations, despite being 19 and 17 years old. Significant developmental delays, as well as health problems like hearing difficulties, congenital heart issues, and dental malformations, were also shown by Samuel, 10, and Rebecca, 8. A series of medical evaluations were undergone by Emma, the daughter of Sarah and Willard, confirming the initial suspicions. Multiple conditions resulting from consanguinity were what the 2-year-old girl had. Beyond the observed physical characteristics, heart problems, low immunity, and significant neuromotor development delays were detected. That she would probably never develop cognitive abilities beyond those of a 4 or 5-year-old child, even in adulthood, was estimated by doctors. Her own story mirrored Sarah's, revealed Martha Dawson when she finally started talking to the authorities. The daughter of a first-degree cousin of Willard's father, she was born Martha Collins. At age 16, she was offered to Willard as his wife, continuing a cycle that, according to her, was considered normal within that family branch. "This was how things were always done, my mother told me," Martha explained in a recorded statement. That keeping the family blood pure was important, she said, that mixing with strangers brought weakness. Deep historical roots were revealed by the investigation for this thinking. From the Scottish Highlands in the early 19th century came the Dawsons' ancestors, bringing beliefs about the importance of maintaining pure family strains. Isolated in the Georgia mountains, far from the social and cultural evolution of the rest of the country, these distorted beliefs not only survived but intensified over generations. The most alarming discovery came when investigators found diaries belonging to Willard's grandfather, written between 1910 and 1935. His disturbing vision for preserving family purity was described in detail by Edwin Dawson in these diaries, along with how he had instructed his son, Willard's father, to continue this practice. Almost clinical observations about the results of these unions were also contained in the diaries, noting the physical characteristics of children born and which were considered successful or flaws. That the practice of consanguinity in the Dawson family was not an isolated case involving Willard, but a deliberate system maintained for generations, resulting in an increasingly compromised genetic line, was the crucial evidence provided by these documents. In March 1979, Willard Dawson's trial began, quickly becoming one of the most notorious cases in Georgia's legal history. A meticulously built case supported by physical evidence, medical records, and the devastating testimonies of Dawson family members was presented by the prosecution, led by Howard Reeves. The public interest could barely be accommodated by the Rabun County Court, a red brick building from the early century. Each development was followed by journalists from Atlanta and even national publications, while Clayton's small community tried to process that such horror had existed for so long, so close to them. Rarely showing emotion, Willard remained impassive throughout the process. An argument based on his client's cultural isolation and ignorance of modern social laws and norms was tried by his defense lawyer, a state-designated professional who clearly struggled with the nature of the case. "The product of generations of isolation in the mountains is my client," argued the lawyer. Believing these practices were normal within his family, he was raised without access to proper education that could have corrected this distorted view. Quickly dismantled by the prosecution was this argument, which had evidence that Willard frequently went to the city, had a functional radio on the property, and had even worked briefly in a local sawmill in the early 1960s before inheriting the family property. Sufficient knowledge of the outside world was had by him to understand his actions were condemned by society, argued prosecutor Reeves. From Martha Dawson came the most impactful testimony. After months of psychological counseling, she finally broke decades of conditioning and spoke about her experience. How she was handed over to Willard as a teenager, how she was kept isolated, and how she eventually became a silent accomplice to the horrors perpetuated against her own daughter was described by her in a trembling voice. "I knew it was wrong," she admitted, tears running down her face. "But when you spend your lifetime being taught that questioning means treason to the family, you lose the ability to oppose. I failed my daughter, and I will never forgive myself for it." In detail, the devastating effects of continued consanguinity over generations were explained by the medical and psychological experts who testified. A detailed study of the Dawson family tree was presented by Dr. Lawrence Freeman, a geneticist from Emory University, demonstrating how the increasingly restricted genetic pool had resulted in a concentration of harmful recessive genes. "A textbook example of the dangers of endogamy is what we see in the Dawson family," explained Dr. Freeman. "The likelihood that harmful recessive genes manifest dramatically increases when close relatives have children together. In this family, where this practice has occurred for at least 4 consecutive generations, a cascade of genetic problems that have become progressively more severe is what we see. How the problems observed in Willard and Martha's older children, from cognitive deficits to heart problems and physical malformations, were direct consequences of this pattern was described by the doctor. But his discussion of Emma, the daughter of Sarah and Willard, was what made his testimony most impactful. What we call extreme endogamic depression is what this child represents, he explained. An even greater concentration of problematic recessive genes is the result when a father has improper relationships with his own daughter, who is already the product of a consanguineous lineage. The chances of serious developmental and health problems exceed 70%. That the fetus already showed signs of multiple developmental complications was indicated by medical reports on Sarah's second pregnancy, still underway during the trial. That the child would likely have even more severe conditions than Emma was predicted by doctors if the pregnancy reached term. How such a situation could exist for so long without intervention was begun to be questioned by the community as the trial advanced. For not properly investigating when the Dawson children stopped attending were criticized local school officials. About the lack of accompaniment visits to the isolated family with multiple children faced questions social assistance authorities. To the systemic failure that allowed the Dawson tragedy to continue for generations was directed part of his accusation by Prosecutor Reeves. "The judgment of one man is not just what this is," he declared in his final argument. "Of a gaze that closed its eyes, a system that failed to protect the most vulnerable, and a culture of silence that allowed the unthinkable to happen just a few kilometers from where we sit today is the judgment." After 7 days of trial and only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty on all charges was Willard Dawson. The maximum sentence permitted by Georgia law at the time was issued by Judge William Hartford, visibly shaken by the case, 3 consecutive 25-year prison sentences, ensuring Willard would never leave prison. 45 years have passed since the Dawson case shocked Georgia and the entire country. Not only for the survivors but also as a powerful reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and community neglect, the consequences of that terrible history continue to reverberate. At Georgia's state penitentiary in 1997 at age 61, Willard Dawson died, never expressing remorse for his actions. After serving 5 years in prison for complicity, Martha spent the rest of her life in a community-assisted living facility for people with mental disorders. She died in 2012 of heart complications, another common result of generations of consanguinity. Several paths were followed by the fate of the Dawson children, all marked by trauma and genetic consequences. Never able to live independently due to their cognitive limitations were Jacob and Thomas, the older children. Decades in institutions for adults with disabilities were spent by both. Thomas died in 2010 from renal failure, and Jacob still lives under supervised care. Specialized education and intensive care were received by Samuel, who was only 10 when his family was discovered. Although he never completely overcame his cognitive deficits, he eventually learned a craft and lives today in an assisted community where he works in an adapted carpentry workshop. Perhaps the one who responded best to intervention was Rebecca, the youngest daughter. Adopted by a family of university professors, she received special education and extensive therapeutic support. Despite learning difficulties, the equivalent of high school was able to be completed by her, and today she works as an assistant in a local library, having found stability and a significant degree of independence. A long and difficult recovery was faced by Sarah Dawson, whose involuntary courage exposed the case. A boy with multiple serious conditions who died before his first year was the result of her second pregnancy. The magnitude of what she had suffered was gradually understood by Sarah after years spent in intensive psychological treatment. An extraordinary step was taken by her at 19. She decided to speak publicly about her experience. In an interview for an educational documentary in 1982, Sarah, then with a clearer understanding of what she had lived, expressed her desire that her story serve as a warning. "I don't want anyone else growing up thinking that was normal or acceptable," she said at the time. "That isolation is not protection is what I want people to understand. It is prison." Under specialized care, Emma, the daughter of Sarah and Willard, grew up, facing multiple medical and developmental challenges. Despite pessimistic predictions, some expectations were exceeded by her, managing to develop basic communication skills and some degree of independence in everyday activities. However, the cognitive development of a 6-year-old child was never exceeded by her. At the age of 25, due to congenital cardiac complications, Emma died in 2001. A life for herself was eventually managed to be built by Sarah. After years of therapy and remedial education, an assistant teacher she met during a rehabilitation program was who she married. A conscious decision based on both her trauma and the genetic risks she carried meant there were no more children. Her adult life was dedicated by her to volunteering in programs for preventing family isolation and detecting warning signs. Eventually demolished by county order was the Dawson property in the Georgia mountains, the site considered a monument to human tragedy. The area has been reforested and is now part of a nature reserve, with no indication of the horror that existed there for decades. Its impact on public policies and social conscience, however, was the most important legacy of the Dawson case. After the trial, its child protection and remote family monitoring protocols were completely revised by the state of Georgia. New laws were implemented, requiring regular checks on families who opted for home education and creating a more robust school abandonment detection system. Valuable lessons were also learned by the medical community from the case. Specific protocols to identify signs of improper relationships were developed by the Clayton Community Hospital, and training for health professionals across the region began to include modules on detecting genetic problems that may indicate consanguinity. Extensively studied by genetics experts were the Dawson medical records, scientifically documenting the devastating effects of multiple generations of consanguinity. Now used in educational programs worldwide, these studies clearly illustrate why taboos against relationships between close relatives exist in virtually all human cultures. In 2008, Project Sarah was the name given to a prevention and education center in honor of Sarah Dawson and her survival journey. Located in Atlanta, the center offers educational resources and support for survivors of improper relationships, as well as training for professionals to identify signals from at-risk families. At the age of 56 in 2019, Sarah passed away, leaving a legacy of courage and transformation. Dozens of professionals who had been inspired by her history to work in protecting vulnerable children were present at her funeral. That her story be told not as sensationalism, but as a painful and necessary reminder that extreme isolation can create spaces where the unthinkable becomes reality was one of her last wishes. That even in the deepest shadows of society, there is the possibility of intervention, healing, and change is what the Dawson history reminds us. It also reminds us of our collective responsibility to be aware of the signs that something is wrong, not to look away from discomfort, and to ensure no child grows up believing suffering is normal or acceptable. Make sure to check if you're already subscribed to this channel. If not, subscribe now to access deep investigations into cases that society prefers to forget, but we need to remember to prevent them from repeating. If you watched this far, it's because you like this story. So I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here." Don't forget to like this video and share it with people who value knowing the truth, however difficult it is. The story of Willard Dawson, the most incestuous father ever exposed in Georgia, and the lives forever altered by generations of isolation and consanguinity, this was it. A story that reminds us that even in the most remote communities, No one should be beyond the reach of protection, education, and the law.